I want to wait till more people get in here or just run it. Yeah, wait. No, I'm not.
It may not look like home, but at this point I don't care. Oh, they were missing from the real man. They swore their loyalty until the very end. Anything you say, King, it's okay, King. You know it's kind of scary on your own. One of the new land, the way we planned. Could you help us run it till it's full? They planted corn, you know, they built their houses one by one. And bit by bit they worked until the colonies were done. They looked around, yeah, up and down, and someone said, hooray! If the people only see us now, we would be proud of us today. They knew that now they'd run their own land. But George the Third still vowed he'd rule to the end. Anything I say, do it my way now. Anything I say, do it my way. Don't you get to feel independent, cause I'm gonna force you to obey. He taxed their property, he didn't give them any choice. And back in England, didn't give them any voice. That's called taxation without representation, and it's not fair. But when the parties were made, the king said, I don't care. England has the nerve to tax our property. To put it kindly, king, we really don't agree. Gonna show you how we be. We're gonna dump this tea and turn this harbor into the biggest cup of tea in history. They wanted no other England. They knew the time had come for them to take command. It's very clear, oh dear, look back here, what you say we won't go there. Gonna have a revolution now, king, if we're gonna run it all away. With no more king,
Don't need that to president.
no more king, no more king,
Run things our way.
no more king. Tell us what to do. Rocket our position, inspection over the horizon. What can it be? Looks like it's going to be a free country.
Okay, so y'all can see all the comments. Wait a minute, we need the PowerPoint back up. Well, I've never liked it for people. That's okay. So how bad were the lectures from my house? Not bad? Mm.
I didn't know if it was my Wi-Fi or something else, but like every once in a while it would buffer, stop working, and then I would like double tap it forward and it just went.
Well, on my end, every once in a while it would flash across the top of the screen. Please wait, your connection's unstable. But I think it was my computer, because I have two of the oldest computers. Actually, I do have two of the oldest computers in history. I'm not using them. I'm using the second oldest computers, and they are so slow. But it's what I got. So, and I'm not ready to invest in a new one yet. But y'all are a better audience than, two snakes and a dog. And my husband who sits far and tries to make me laugh. Okay, so y'all are gonna see more slides than you have on what I put online because I didn't get them done in time. And I got them done in time for class, but not in time to post. So I will post them this afternoon sometime. You can catch up. It's not, I think you will be fine. Is that big enough for y'all to read? Okay. So I figure this way I can actually see if somebody says something, or y'all can see if somebody says something and say, hey, somebody ask a question. All right, so we've gotten to the Boston Tea Party. Resentment is simmering, and it's just waiting for that spark. The Boston Massacre wasn't quite enough to push it over the edge, but they're getting there. And Lord North is going to add fuel to the fire. Remember, they kept the tea tax as a token tax to say, hey, we can still tax you. But nobody really cared because most of the tea that they were drinking in the colonies was smuggled in from Holland anyway. And you have to understand, I mean, it seems kind of weird looking back on it. This whole thing starts over tea. Tea was very important. Tea was a social event. Tea was the drink. They drank tea like we drink coffee, except I don't drink coffee, I actually drink tea. It was a staple. And it had been a big part of, this colonialism to get to India, to get to tea, and the trade with India and countries that created tea was part of the colonial experience. And to help friends in the English East Indian Tea Company, I'm sure, even though it's an old movie, you've all seen Pirates of the Caribbean. And they have the trunk and it has EEIC. That stands for East India Tea Company. English East India Company. So it had, little fingers all over the world. But it was a mismanaged company in 73. And Lord North proposed the Tea Act of 1773. It would allow the company to send Asian tea directly to America without paying any taxes. No duties. Just ship it from India straight to the colonies. That makes your tea cheaper because you don't have to add those extra costs in. So supposedly, logic would follow that the British merchants, tea merchants, could then undercut the colonial competition, i.e. the smugglers who were bringing it in from Holland and other places. And at the same time, the Tea Act orders British authorities in New England to clamp down on said smugglers. The Committee on Correspondence alerts the colonists to the new danger. They're trying to purchase our love with cheap tea. We can't drink cheap tea. We want them to stop taxing us. Don't buy the tea. On December 16th, 1773, 16 men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 ships that had come into the Boston Harbor and pitched all the tea overboard. 342 chests of tea to cheers from crowds that were gathered up on the shore. However, when officials came to investigate, no one saw anything. John Adams said that it was a move that was so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible The colonists were rallying. People were actually not drinking tea at all. Women a lot joined into this boycott a lot because, like I said, this is a social event. Every day, you would have tea time, and you would gather. And now the politically correct move in 1773 was to turn your teacup upside down as a sign of protest. But not all were quite that supportive. Not all the people in the colonies were happy. Even Benjamin Franklin, who was in London at the time trying to, negotiate, said that that went a little too far. That was wanton destruction of personal property, and that the parties responsible should pay for the tea, or the colonies themselves should pay for the tea. George was not at all amused, insisting that the colonies must either submit or triumph. And he instructs Lord North to make an example of Boston. So more acts are going to be passed. In England, they call them the coercive acts. In the Americas, they call them the intolerable acts. There's 4 measures that are passed by Parliament designed to punish Boston. And these are all passed in 1774. The first is the Boston Port Act, which closed the harbor from June 1st, 1774, and to the point where the tea is paid for. Once the tea is paid for, you can open the harbor back up. The Act for Impartial Administration of Justice. Let the governor transfer any case of an official accused of committing an offense in the line of duty to England for trial. So no more redcoats are going to be tried in the American colonies. If there's another Boston Massacre, those soldiers will be taken to London and tried, where they will find a more favorable court, obviously. It takes any legal means of justice out of the colonist hands. A new quartering act is passed that directs the local authorities to find lodging for troops, even going so far as to put them in local homes if necessary. That means you could wake up one morning and be host to a half a dozen redcoats living in your little small house, and you have to feed them, and they don't have to help. And because of the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre, they're now going to bring more troops into Boston. And the last one is the Massachusetts Government Act, which made all of the colonies council and law officials appointed rather than elected. If there was a jury trial, the jurors are selected by the sheriff, who is appointed, not elected. And no town meetings could be held without the governor's consent. And the governor is going to soon be, at the time, it's Hutchinson, but on May 1774, General Thomas Gage replaces Hutchinson as governor, and at the same time assumes command of 4,000 troops. So if your governor is a military man who is also commanding the troops in your town, you're basically now under martial law. It's unspoken, but it's there. These acts are designed to isolate Boston and make it an example. But instead, it made Boston the rallying point for all of the colonies. It galvanized support across the colonies it proved that the king was not going to be reasonable. Parliament was not going to be reasonable. And I keep saying the king. At this point, the colonists are blaming Parliament. They're not blaming the king particularly. Their beef is with Parliament because Parliament is the one passing all of the laws. But now everybody's looking at Boston, and it's an example. This is an example of what England can do to you. If they can do it to Boston, they can do it to anybody. So we need to come together. Further proof came with the Quebec Act in June of '74 that stated Canada would not have a representative assembly, but would only have a royal governor and council. And it also gave privileged position to the Catholic Church, basically made the Catholic Church the official religion of Canada. It also took some western lands north of the Ohio River Valley that both Virginia and Connecticut claimed, but that's a minor thing. The fact that they took this whole new territory and said no representation at all, not even locally, sent a shockwave through the colonies. They were also a little bit hacked about the Catholic Church thing. They had just fought to get the French Catholics out, and now you're giving it back. And there's a real fear. It took me a long time to wrap my head around why people don't like the Catholic Church. You know, what's wrong with the Catholic Church? There's nothing wrong with the Catholic Church. The fear comes because the Catholic Church answers to one man, the Pope. The Pope runs the entire Catholic Church. That's the way the hierarchy is set up. And there was, in the 1700s, 1800s, even in the 1900s, actually even into the 20th century, there has always been this underlying fear of a papist plot to take over the world. That's why when Kennedy is elected in 1960, they make a big deal out of the fact that he's the first Catholic president. It's just this weird underlying fear that because the Pope can command churches all over the world, that all of a sudden, he's going to decide to take over the world. So that's kind of a side note, but that's the explanation of why there's always this weird fear of the Catholic Church. So the colonies decide they're going to resist. First, they start raising money and sending provisions to Boston, because without the port being open, you don't have, they can't get things in unless they're brought in from the other colonies, from the interior. So that's what they do. They start raising money and sending provisions. Other colonies either dump tea, burn tea, or boycott tea. So the poor, mismanaged English East India Company doesn't benefit from the Tea Act that was supposed to help save their company. Nobody's drinking their tea. The Virginia Assembly is dissolved after Thomas Jefferson proposes setting aside June 1st as a day of fasting and prayer. Remember, June 1st is when the Port Act is supposed to go into effect. He proposes this in the Virginia Assembly. The Loyalist governor says, no, we're not even going to have an assembly. But again, they're going to keep meeting. And similar things happen in other colonies. And the colonists, through these correspondence committees and other acts or other means of communication, decide that they're going to meet together. And the First Continental Congress meets September 5th, 1774 in Philadelphia. They put together some resolutions, the first being the Suffolk Resolves that declare the intolerable acts null and void. They urge Massachusetts to arm for defense, and they call for economic sanctions against England. The economic sanctions has been boycotting, essentially, has been effective. They've used it in the past, and it's been very effective in changing the way Parliament acts. They also write out a Declaration of American Rights, and in that, they proclaim the rights of Americans as English citizens. They deny Parliament's authority to act on internal colonial affairs, and they protest the standing army in the colonies by proclaiming that each colonial assembly could determine the need for British troops. So they're saying that if we don't want you here, you can't be here. They write these up, they send them across the ocean. A Continental Association is formed in 1974 that recommends each county, town, and city form committees to enforce the boycott of all British goods. These are elected committees, and these committees are going, and they kind of spring out of the correspondence committees. There's a lot of overlap in who's on what committee, but it's just a little more formalized, and it's one step closer. This Continental Association is going to become the organizational and communication network for the revolutionary movement. And by enforcing the boycott, they're making people take sides. They actually wrote out contracts and went around in town saying, you need to sign this to support our cause. If you didn't sign it, you were immediately labeled a loyalist. About 7,000 men served on these committees. Women also participated, reinvigorating the Daughters of Liberty. And the Continental Congress also advocates non-importation of British goods in 1774, basically the boycott. We're not even going to bring it into the colonies. And if that doesn't work, in 1775, they're going to start a non-exportation plan. So not only are they not going to buy things from British merchants, they're not going to sell raw materials to British merchants, denying them the supplies they need. They have, this has a concrete objective. It has some unintended results as well. By reducing imports, people still need things. You still need cups. You still need spoons. You need the things that you were importing from England. So if you can't import them, what do? You make them. So you see a growth in American industries. They're still small industries, but you see a growth. And thousands of people participate in this. It's the common people that enforce the boycott. It's the common people who volunteer in the militia, who attend the town meetings. They're getting wider spread public support for a lot of these movements. King George and Parliament both insist that there's going to be no negotiation. They basically reject the Suffolk Resolves and the Declaration of American Rights. And that simmers rising a little bit higher. There's still a lot of people who are looking for a peaceful recourse to all of this. England is by far the most powerful country in the world. And the American colonies are itty bitty. They have no army, they have militia. So while you have some people who are ready to jump on the revolutionary bandwagon, you have a lot of people that are not real sure, and then you have loyalists. You have people who are looking at people like Samuel Adams and calling him a traitor. You know, we are English. We're an English colony. This is basically, they're saying this is all wrong. Early in 1775, Parliament declares that Massachusetts is in rebellion and prohibits all of the New England colonies from trading outside of the empire. So Connecticut can't trade, not that they were trading legally outside the empire anyway, but they cracked down on it. But the non-importation starts to work. British merchants are feeling the pinch, and they're starting to pinch Parliament. So in February of 1775, Lord North proposes the conciliatory resolution. And in this, Parliament will refrain from any measures but taxes to regulate trade, which most people are okay with. You can have import duties that make it, more expensive for a foreign country to bring goods in than your own country. Each colony would receive the duties from within its boundary in exchange for a voluntary contribution towards defense. So not only is Parliament willing to say, we're not going to tax to raise revenue, what we do raise will stay in the colonies. But you colonists have to promise to help pay for your defense. And it tones it down for a little bit. There are still people who are pushing for more action, but the simmer has been reduced. So while the tone has toned down, the colonists are still preparing. And the British think that they have gotten everything under control. They haven't quite gotten everything under control. The colonists' idea of preparing is to stockpile arms and ammunition. And on April 14th, 1775, General Thomas Gage received secret orders from England to stop the, quote, open rebellion in Massachusetts. That through the conciliatory resolves, they kind of said didn't happen, but they still haven't paid for the tea, so they're still considered in rebellion. Gage decides that the best course of action is to arrest the rebel leaders at Concord and seize the supply depot. General Pitcairn is one of the officers in Boston, says the colonists will be easy to contain that, let me see if I can find the quote. Yeah. John Pitcairn wrote home from Boston in 1775, quote, "I am satisfied that one active campaign, a smart action, and burning 2 or 3 of their towns will set everything to right." He didn't have much faith in this American militia. But on April 18th, 700 redcoats gather on the Boston Common and set out for Concord. Local patriots, Paul Revere and William Dawes, are sent out to spread the word. There's actually a few others that usually go unnamed, and this time I didn't look up their names. There's even a woman that was one of the riders that was going out to spread the word. She was the daughter of one of the men, and she snagged a horse and went with them. Revere reached Lexington about midnight and alerted Hancock and Adams. He rode on to Concord with Samuel Dawes and another man, William Dawes and Samuel Prescott. They get caught, but Prescott somehow manages to escape and get through and gets to Concord in time to warn. On April 19th, Captain John Parker and 70 American militiamen, Minutemen, line up on the Lexington Green. Parker only meant for this to be a protest, a silent protest. We're going to stand here with our arms. The British are going to march past, but they're going to see us. We're going to be a threat, but we're not going to do anything. Major Pitcairn comes in, shouting and swinging his sword, calling them dogs and telling them to disperse. Well, in the excitement, somebody fires. Nobody knows who fired. Nobody knows which side. But the British volley, the British respond by shooting a volley and charging with bayonets, leaving 10 wounded and 8 dead. Basically, the British lose control of their troops momentarily. But they get them back under control and move on to Concord. By the time they get to Concord, most of the stockpile of ammo and arms has been carried off. The British destroy what's left. There's no rebel leaders to be found anywhere. So it's essentially a wasted effort. And now they have to get back. They've got to go back to Boston. And they have to go back the same way they came. When they get to the North Bridge again, the militia are there. But this time, they're hiding behind rocks, trees, and they start sniping. They manage to inflict 15 casualties. More casualties are inflicted by the time they get back to Boston, because basically from Concord to Boston, they are running a gauntlet of angry colonists with guns behind trees, because Minutemen don't care about lining up and fighting true military style. They're used to fighting Indians. They fought in the French and Indian Wars. They don't want to get shot. So, sniping. By the time they get back to Boston, the British have suffered 3 times as many casualties as the Americans. And Pitcairn has a new respect for the American troops. That's the shot heard around the world. When that odd shot gets fired on the Lexington Green and all hell breaks loose. The war has started. The Second Continental Congress is going to meet May 10, 1775. Boston is put under siege. They've got the harbor to the front of them, and there's hills that surround Boston. So it's kind of easy to isolate it. And they start fighting in other places as well. Fort Ticonderoga, which we talked about a little bit when we took it from the French, falls to the Green Mountain Boys under Ethan Allen from Vermont and Massachusetts Volunteers under Benedict Arnold from Connecticut. 2 days later, they take Crown Point. On June 15th, Washington is named Commander-in-Chief, and at his assistance, it's with no pay. Washington was the obvious choice. He was very much a leader during the French and Indian Wars. He came from Virginia, which was one of the more popular colonies. He is independently wealthy. He can afford to do this with no pay. He also just looked the part. It probably didn't hurt that he also came to most of the meetings in his military uniform. But he's now Commander-in-Chief, and he takes over the American Army. The first big battle is the Battle of Bunker Hill. Battle of Bunker Hill was actually fought on Breed's Hill. They were originally going to fight on Bunker Hill, but then it was being held in part by the British, and Breed's Hill is a little higher, so the Americans fortified the high ground. It's a group of Minutemen and militia from Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, some freed slaves, some odd militia from Massachusetts. So a kind of rabbly group facing Sir William Howe, Sir Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, British commanders. And they fought to a crowd. It always amazes me when you have battles and civilians gather around to watch. This happens in the Civil War too. People sat on rooftops, watched out windows. There were about 2,400 British troops. I don't have the number on Americans, but there weren't nearly that many. But the Americans had the high ground. And like good British soldiers, they tried to take it. And they tried to take it by running uphill into a volley of fire. The British will suffer almost half casualties. They lose a little over 1,000. The Americans lose about 400. And the British technically win the battle. It takes 3 charges up the hill. And on the last charge, the Americans are out of ammunition and are starting just to throw rocks. But not getting shot at, the remaining British troops managed to get through and attack with bayonets, rout the Americans. But you might win the battle, but you don't win the war. I mean, it was a high cost battle. You can't go into battle and lose almost half your men every time. The effects of this were that the English generals would be more cautious in the future. And Continental Congress realized we need an army, and they call for all men to enlist. At this point, there's no middle ground left. You were either with us or against us from the colonial point of view. And if you're against us, that's a dangerous place to be. Loyalists were not treated kindly in the colonies. The remaining American troops keep the high ground. They take Dorchester Heights and they threaten the city with cannon and mortars and keep it under siege. Howe will finally retreat to Halifax by sea, with the last troops leaving on March 17th. But the colonists still think there is some hope. And on July 6, 1775, they send an appeal to the king called the Olive Branch Petition. It professes their loyalty and asks for a ceasefire to work out a reconciliation. King George won't even read it. He's hacked. These are ungrateful colonists who just need to be punished. On August 23rd, the king replies with a declared proclamation of rebellion. The colonists also, when they send the Olive Branch, send another document called the Declaration of Causes and the Necessity of Taking Up Arms, trying to explain their position to the king and Parliament. But with the king declaring that they're in a state of rebellion, it really doesn't matter. Okay. So you're starting to see a spread beyond Boston. We've already had some fighting in the Canadian territories with Ticonderoga and Crown Point. And the Americans think maybe they can get the French, the leftover French in Quebec, to come to their side. But they didn't really go about it well. They go about it by attacking Quebec. I think the idea is we'll get Quebec back from the British and give it to the French, and the French will stay on our side. But like I said, it doesn't go well. Not only is it kind of a sketchy plan, the troops that are sent are militia, and they have short terms of enlistment, and their enlistments were getting near the end. So it rushes the attack. Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold are in charge of the troops, and they decided to attack on December 31st. And they end up retreating. But the bigger problem is, as they get up to Quebec, smallpox breaks out among the troops. Smallpox is ugly. And when they retreat with it, they bring it back to their homes, to their families, to the colonies. And while you can convince somebody to step up and fight the British, where you have a fighting chance, it's hard to convince somebody to join an army that's rife with smallpox. You might be willing to face a bullet, but you don't want to face smallpox. And this is their first military setback. It's not going to be their last. The early fighting for the colonists doesn't go really, really well. In the South, they have a little bit more success. The Loyalist Virginia governor raises a Loyalist force, including slaves that he has promised freedom to if they fight. They are defeated. In North Carolina, some Loyalist Highland Scots attack Charleston. They are also defeated. So they have a little bit more luck in the South, but it's not great. During all of this, Continental Congress is meeting and trying to set up some sort of provisional government. We haven't declared our independence yet, but we're acting like we have. They appoint commissioners that will negotiate with the Indians. They organize a post office, a postal service under Benjamin Franklin, which makes sense since he organized the colonial one. They create a navy. They create a Marine Corps. But they aren't ready to take that step and actually declare independence. That's going to come with a little bit of prompting. It's kind of like no one really has the words yet to express what they're feeling. And Thomas Paine will supply that in a little pamphlet called Common Sense. Thomas Paine was not the most successful man. He had come to the Americas to set up he had failed at business in England, had come to Americas to set up a school. That failed. So he got into politics. And he is an amazing writer. And he writes a little pamphlet that explains that maybe we shouldn't be mad at Parliament. Maybe our beef is actually with the king. And if you follow Locke's logic that you have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and if your king does not provide that, you have the right to revolt. We talked about this before when we talked about Locke's theory. So Paine directly attacks the allegiance to the monarchy, which was like the last frayed connection. Yes. Okay, go. Good luck. So he wrote that it was only common sense to abandon King George and declare their independence. And his pamphlet worked very well in convincing the colonists. Over 150,000 copies were printed and distributed within 3 months. Colonies, one by one, authorized delegates to move on independence. On June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia made the motion that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. His resolution passes on June 2nd. So that is truly our Independence Day. That is the day they passed it. But the actual Declaration of Independence, the document, is adopted 2 days later on July 4th. Back a little bit in June, the Continental Congress had appointed Jefferson, Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman the task of writing a public explanation of colonial discontent and the rationale for independence. Jefferson and Adams of that group were asked to produce the first draft. Adams said, "Hey, Jefferson, you write really well, you do it." So Jefferson sat down using what he had written in the Virginia Constitution and George Mason's draft of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and he wrote out a document that created a firm and plain statement of the American mind. To us, it sounds very flowery, but at the time, it was a very concise document. It stated in plain language what the colonists wanted. The draft went back to the committee. They only made 86 changes. One was to take out a reference to slavery that Georgia and South Carolina objected to. But 86 changes in one document is not bad. Not a document of the length of the Declaration of Independence. And he appealed not to rights of Englishmen, but to rights of men. And yes, there is some hypocrisy in this because Africans, Indians, and women are not even included in this document. You can say that it is men in the most generic sense as being men and as men equals humans, but it was really men, white men. Washington had the document read to all of his troops, and we are now actually, oops, I'm sorry, I should have switched slides, at war. And we will stop there, and I may see if I can find a good short video that I don't want to go through every battle because we're already behind on time. And besides that, I really don't like, I work at a fort and I deal with military history all the time. Battles are my least favorite thing. To me, I lose all interest when you start talking about, well, there were 25 men over here and there were 15 men over there and these were carrying this kind of gun and these had this. I don't want those details. Just tell me the results. So I'll try to find a video and then we can kind of talk more about the social part of the American Revolution when we pick up. So we will stop here. I hope you guys have a great weekend. Are y'all going to go to the game? Yes? No? Yes? I'm debating it. I haven't decided yet. But I will see y'all on Monday.